The calm before the storm. The day started like any other on the quiet space station orbiting Earth. It was a peaceful place, far from the chaos and noise of Earth's surface. The people here lived their lives in a quiet routine, going about their work without fear or concern. The Earth below them looked calm, a perfect blue and green orb against the dark vastness of space. But deep in the heart of space, something stirred, something no one on the station could see yet. Captain Sarah Lane gazed out of the observation window, sipping her morning coffee. Her shift was just beginning, and she was looking forward to another routine day. The station had been on alert before, with passing asteroids and minor glitches in the system, but today was different. There was a strange feeling in the air, something she couldn't put her finger on. "Captain, you might want to take a look at this," came the voice of Lieutenant Harris from the communications console. Sarah turned to see him staring intently at the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't one to panic, so if he was concerned, it meant something was wrong. She walked over to him and peered at the display. It was a blip, just a small, faint signal from deep space, far beyond any known planetary systems. At first, it seemed unimportant, like many other passing signals that the station had intercepted before. But there was something unusual about it. "Can you trace the source?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Harris shook his head. "It's faint, Captain, but it's growing stronger. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The signal wasn't like anything the station scanners had picked up before. It wasn't coming from any known ships, satellites, or even space debris. The signal was almost intentional, as though it were reaching out to them. "We're not the only ones out here," Sarah muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else. "Shall I send a response?" Harris asked. "No," Sarah said sharply. "Not yet. Let's see what happens. Keep monitoring." The feeling in her gut told her that responding now would be a mistake. She couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Her thoughts turned to the strange tales of unexplored space, where ancient civilizations and unknown forces waited in the darkness. She had dismissed them all as myths and stories for children. But now, something felt different. This signal was the first true sign that something beyond human understanding was reaching out. As the hours passed, the station carried on with its routine. But Sarah's mind kept returning to the signal. Her crew went about their duties, unaware of the potential danger lurking just beyond their reach. Outside, the stars sparkled, and the soft hum of the station's engines filled the air. But Sarah knew that something was coming. She could feel it deep inside. Later that day, the signal grew stronger still. Harris continued to track it, and now they could pinpoint it more clearly. It was coming from a point in space where no known star or planet existed. The energy readings were off the charts, far beyond anything the station's sensors had ever detected. They were dealing with something far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. "Captain, the signal's not just getting stronger, it's getting closer," Harris said, his voice rising with concern. A shiver ran through Sarah's body. "Closer? How much closer?" "It's hard to say, Captain. But if it's any indication of where it's coming from, it could be heading straight for us." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She looked out the window again, her mind racing. The calm of space seemed to mock her. Everything was quiet, peaceful, like nothing could ever disturb this perfect balance. But now, in the dark corners of the universe, something vast and terrible was on the move. She grabbed her communicator and quickly called for an emergency briefing with the crew. Within minutes, the station's officers gathered in the command center, all eyes on her as she stood before them, her face grim. "We've detected an unknown signal," she began, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. "It's coming from deep space, and it's getting closer to us. We don't know who or what is sending it, but I need everyone to be on alert. This could be a threat, and we need to prepare for the worst." The room fell silent as the officers exchanged nervous glances. No one had expected this. They were supposed to be safe out here, far from any conflict or danger. Yet deep in the heart of space, a storm was brewing, and they were caught right in its path. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Sarah knew they had no choice but to prepare for the unknown. The calm before the storm was almost over. As the crew moved into action, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just preparing for a threat. They were preparing for the end. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something far darker than anyone could imagine? The sky above them was still quiet, but Sarah knew that silence wouldn't last for long. The storm was coming, and it was bringing an empire with it. The fleet approaches. The silence that followed the emergency briefing was deafening. The crew had mobilized quickly, but there was no hiding the sense of unease that hung over the station like a thick fog. Outside the observation windows, space was still as serene as ever. But inside the command center, there was a palpable tension. No one spoke. They just waited. It had been hours since the strange signal had first appeared. Hours since Lieutenant Harris had confirmed it was not only growing stronger, but was now pinpointing a location in deep space, a location far too close for comfort. Sarah had given orders to monitor the signal closely, but her mind was far from calm. The screen flickered as Harris adjusted the tracking system, his face pale. "Captain, the signal. It's not just close. It's right on top of us. And it's not one signal. There are dozens, maybe hundreds more, all converging." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Hundreds?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Where are they coming from?" Harris hesitated before speaking, his eyes locked on the screen. I don't know, Captain. The data is conflicting. But whatever is out there, it's massive." A ripple of shock passed through the room. The crew exchanged nervous glances, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They had prepared for unknown dangers before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could explain the magnitude of what they were facing. Captain Lane stood up straight, trying to maintain control. "We need to prepare for contact. Get all defense systems online. Communicate with Earth. We need backup. Lieutenant, increase the signal scan. Let's figure out exactly what we're dealing with here." She turned and began to pace, her mind racing. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over her, as though something was just beyond her reach, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The calm they had once taken for granted felt like a distant memory. Minutes later, Harris's voice broke through her thoughts. "Captain, I have more data. The signal isn't just coming from one ship. It's a fleet. And it's huge. The ships are unlike anything we've ever seen. Their design, it's completely foreign to us." Sarah's mind reeled. A fleet of unknown ships, all converging on their position. It felt like a nightmare, one they couldn't escape. She moved closer to Harris, staring at the screen. The images that appeared were nothing like the sleek, familiar designs of human ships. These were dark, massive, and imposing, almost unnatural in their scale. "Can we identify their origin?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. "We've tried," Harris replied, shaking his head. "But we can't. It's as if their technology is so advanced, our systems can't even register their point of origin. They're using frequencies that we can't decode. Whatever these ships are, they're not from any known galaxy." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was used to the unknown. Space was full of mysteries. But this was something entirely different. The fear in her crew's eyes was unmistakable. They were facing something far beyond their understanding. "Is there any way to stop them?" someone asked from the back of the room, voice trembling. Sarah's gaze flicked to the crew member, and she immediately knew the truth. There was no way to stop them. Not yet. The station's defenses were good, but not against an unknown enemy with the power of an entire fleet behind them. "Not unless we learn more," Sarah said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We need to hold our ground and figure out their next move." But I don't think we have much time. Suddenly, the ship's alarms blared, cutting her off. The station shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. It wasn't a regular shake. This was different. This felt like the kind of tremor you'd feel just before a storm hit, the earth shifting beneath your feet. "Report," Sarah shouted, regaining her composure. "We're under attack," Harris shouted back. "Something's firing at us from space. I'm seeing energy blasts. Massive, powerful. They're not just testing us. They're attacking." The lights flickered as another blast shook the station, this one stronger than the last. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They hadn't even seen the enemy yet, and already they were being attacked. "Return fire," she ordered. "Target their lead ships. Get us into combat position. Now." Her crew scrambled into action, their fear transforming into focus as they began to operate the station's weapon systems. Sarah's mind raced. She had expected to face an invasion, but this was happening too quickly. There was no time to prepare, no time to think things through. This was no longer a simple encounter. It was a full-scale assault, and they were the first to feel its fury. As the station's weapons fired, she watched in horror as the energy blasts from the enemy fleet cut through space like a knife through butter, bypassing their defenses with ease. The sky above them grew darker, and Sarah knew, deep down, that the battle for humanity's survival had just begun. The enemy was here, and they were not going to stop until humanity was erased from existence. The fight for survival. The impact of the enemy's first strike sent a wave of panic through the crew, but Captain Sarah Lane had no time for fear. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she needed to think fast. The station's shields were holding for now, but barely. The next blast could break through them entirely. Her hands tightened around the control panel as she issued orders with calm authority, despite the chaos unfolding around her. "Get the secondary shields online. All defensive positions now," she commanded. Harris's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, the enemy ships, they're unlike anything we've faced. Their energy output is off the charts. We can't get a lock on them fast enough. Every shot they take is stronger than the last." Sarah's mind raced. They were losing ground fast, and the enemy had the upper hand. She couldn't afford to let her crew see fear in her eyes. They needed her to be strong, to lead them through this nightmare. "Hold steady, everyone. We can still turn this around," she said, though even she wasn't sure how. Lieutenant Harris quickly pulled up more data on the attacking fleet. The enemy ships were enormous, far larger than any warships humanity had ever constructed. Their sleek, dark surfaces reflected no light, giving them an almost ghostly appearance in the vastness of space. They moved as one, coordinated, precise, like a swarm of predators hunting their prey. There was no room for hesitation. Humanity's fleet had only moments to adapt if they were to survive this attack. A new series of blasts rang out, shaking the station once again. The crew had already begun to return fire, but it was clear the enemy had the advantage. As Sarah watched the enemy ships launch another barrage, something inside her clicked. The enemy wasn't just here to destroy them. They were testing their defenses. They were learning. "Captain, the enemy ships are advancing on our position. They're focusing on the main power grid," Harris reported, his voice full of urgency. "If they disable the grid, we'll be defenseless." Sarah's eyes narrowed. It was the first real weakness she had seen in the enemy's strategy. An opening, however small, to exploit. If they could hold on long enough to hit back, they might stand a chance. "Get a team to the power grid. We can't afford to lose it. We need to outsmart them, not outgun them," Sarah ordered. She turned to the operations officer, her voice sharp. "Can we reroute power to the weapon systems?" "Working on it now, Captain. But it'll take time. We're being targeted from multiple directions," the officer replied, sweat dripping from his forehead as he worked quickly. Sarah's heart pounded. Time was something they didn't have. She glanced at the view screen again. The Dark Fleet was closing in, their weapons charging for another round. There was no room for error. "We need a distraction," Sarah said aloud, her mind whirling. "If we can keep them off balance long enough, maybe we can buy some time." Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, his expression grim. "I've got an idea, Captain. But it's risky. We could create a massive burst of energy, like a decoy, forcing the enemy to focus their fire somewhere else. It won't last long, but it might just give us the opening we need." Sarah hesitated. The risk was immense. It could either buy them precious seconds, or it could be the final mistake that doomed them. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, steely determination in her voice. "Do it." Within moments, Harris and his team worked quickly to set up the emergency procedure. The station's power grid was rerouted, generating a burst of energy that erupted outward, making it appear as if a major section of the station was in jeopardy. The enemy ships, reacting almost immediately, redirected their fire toward the decoy. Sarah held her breath as the energy burst lit up the screen, mimicking an explosion on the station's outer hull. The enemy's fleet seemed to take the bait. Their focus shifted, and the onslaught momentarily stopped. The station was still under attack, but for a brief moment, their aim was off. "Now," Sarah shouted, eyes flashing with renewed hope. "Target their lead ship with everything we've got." The crew worked in synchronized chaos. The weapons systems were pushed to their limits as they fired on the enemy's flagship. Every shot counted now. A direct hit, then another. For a moment, the enemy's flagship faltered, its shields flickering as if it was struggling to maintain its defensive systems. The crew on the station watched in shock as the massive ship began to pull back, its once imposing presence wavering. "We've got them," someone yelled in the background, though Sarah didn't let herself be swayed by false hope. It was just one battle, one moment of success. The enemy could adjust their strategy in seconds. "Keep firing," Sarah ordered, her voice unwavering. "Don't stop until we've neutralized their lead ship." The station's cannons thundered in space, blasting another round of energy at the enemy flagship. But just as it seemed they were gaining the upper hand, a new signal flashed across the screen. "Captain, more ships are coming in. This isn't their full force. They've been holding back," Harris reported, his voice grim. Sarah's stomach sank. It had been a brief moment of hope, but now she could feel the reality of their situation pressing down on her. The enemy's fleet was far larger than they had anticipated. The sky above them was darkening, but not just from the enemy ships. There was no escape. The battle was just beginning, and humanity was outnumbered. The fight for survival wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about outlasting an enemy that had all the time and power in the universe. And Sarah knew, deep down, that humanity had no choice but to fight until the very end. A desperate decision. The enemy fleet was now visible on every monitor, their numbers far beyond what Sarah had ever imagined. The earlier moments of hope faded quickly, replaced by the chilling realization that they were vastly outmatched. The few remaining ships from humanity's fleet were fighting with everything they had, but the dark ships from the enemy's armada were relentless, and their firepower was overwhelming. "Captain," Harris said, his voice tight with anxiety, "we've lost another section of the station. The shields can't take much more. If we don't do something fast, we'll be sitting ducks." Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the control panel. Her heart raced. There were no more tricks left to play. The decoy had worked for only a moment, and now the enemy was pushing them to the edge. If they didn't come up with a plan, and fast, they would be annihilated. "We need to pull back," one of the officers suggested from the back of the room, his voice low. "We've sustained too much damage. We can't keep fighting like this." Sarah turned to him sharply. "We can't retreat. Do you think they'll let us just run away? They'll hunt us down wherever we go. The only way out of this is to find a way to strike back. We need to make them understand that we won't go down without a fight." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that pulling back meant abandoning Earth, leaving the entire planet defenseless. That wasn't an option. Not for Sarah, and not for the men and women who had sworn to protect humanity. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in Sarah's mind. It was their only chance, but it would come at a cost. "Lieutenant Harris," she began, her voice calm but heavy with resolve, "I want you to analyze the enemy's weakest point. We're going to hit them where it hurts. We need to make them think twice about destroying us." Harris looked uncertain. "Captain, we've barely scratched the surface of their fleet. What if we miss? What if it doesn't work?" "There's no choice, Harris," she said, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "We don't get a second chance here. We strike now, or we lose everything." The crew moved swiftly, their sense of urgency palpable. For the first time in hours, Sarah saw the fear in their eyes, fear that mirrored her own. But there was no room for fear now, only action. They had one shot. The power grid was barely holding together as it was, but Sarah knew it could be used as a weapon. If they rerouted all available energy into a concentrated blast, it might be enough to disable the lead enemy ships. But doing so meant they would have no power left to defend themselves. The decision weighed heavily on her. She knew the risks. If the attack failed, they would have no means to retaliate, no way to survive the oncoming assault. Yet she also knew that if they didn't try, humanity would be wiped out with nothing to show for it. "Prepare the grid for a concentrated pulse. I'm giving the order to fire," Sarah commanded, standing tall as the room buzzed with activity. As the crew worked furiously to prepare the weapons system, Sarah turned to her second-in-command, Commander Jameson. "Get the escape pods ready. If this doesn't work, we need to get as many people off the station as possible." Jameson nodded grimly. "Understood, Captain." The pulse would need to be quick, precise, and powerful enough to destabilize the enemy's fleet, at least long enough to give humanity's forces a fighting chance. But Sarah was painfully aware of the limitations. The energy blast could disable the station's systems entirely, and if they missed their target, they would have no power left to fight back. A voice echoed from the far side of the room. "Captain, the enemy fleet is realigning. They're moving toward us again. This might be our last chance." The countdown had begun. "Fire the pulse," Sarah ordered. A massive surge of energy blasted out from the station's core, bright and blinding. The entire room shook as the pulse shot toward the lead enemy ships. For a moment, there was only silence, a strange pause in the chaos of battle. The crew stared at the screen, waiting to see the result of their desperate attack. Then the screens flickered. The enemy ship's formation scattered as the energy pulse hit its mark. The lead ships began to lose control, their shields flickering and failing. Several of the larger vessels seemed to veer off course, their weapons systems malfunctioning. "It's working," Harris shouted, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah couldn't let herself feel relief. Not yet. There was no time for celebration. The pulse had disrupted their formation, but the enemy was regaining control faster than expected. They were regrouping, and they were furious. "We've only bought ourselves a few minutes," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to move fast." But just as the crew began to prepare for their next move, another alarm blared, louder this time. The systems were failing. Power was dropping rapidly, and the damage to the station was becoming too great to ignore. The pulse had drained more energy than they had anticipated, and now they were vulnerable. "Captain, we've lost all non-essential systems," the operations officer called out. "We have minimal power left. The shields won't last much longer." Sarah's heart sank. The time for a decisive victory was slipping away. The enemy wasn't just attacking. They were methodically tearing apart every defense humanity had left. There was no more room for hesitation. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice low. "We either win now, or we lose everything. I want every remaining ship in position. Prepare for the final push." She turned, her eyes meeting the faces of the crew, the faces of the men and women who had put their lives on the line. There was no turning back now. They would fight until the very end. The last stand. The station was barely holding together. Sparks flew from damaged panels, and the hum of the power grid had become a low, ominous buzz. The once pristine walls were now marred with cracks, and the faint smell of burnt electronics filled the air. Outside the station, the enemy fleet loomed, its dark ships circling like vultures, waiting for the final blow. Humanity's forces were dwindling, their strength fading with each passing moment. "Captain, the shields are down to 20%. Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice strained with the weight of their dire situation. "We've lost most of our weapon systems. We can't take much more." Sarah's heart was heavy, but her resolve remained unshaken. They couldn't afford to lose. This wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. She had no illusions about the odds. They were almost certainly outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But if they could hold out just a little longer, they might buy humanity the time it needed to mount a defense, to prepare for the next wave. This was their last chance. "Ready the remaining ships," Sarah commanded, her voice cold and steady despite the turmoil around her. "We fight until the very end." Across the bridge, crew members scrambled into their positions, preparing for a final, desperate assault. The few remaining warships left in their fleet were already struggling to stay operational, but they would be enough. For now, every ship, every soul on board would fight as if it were their last. And for many, it would be. The view outside the station darkened as the enemy ships drew closer. Sarah watched as their lead vessel hovered ominously in the distance, its massive form casting a shadow over everything. The air was thick with tension. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for everything humanity had built. Every ship, every person on this station represented the collective will of mankind. If they fell now, there would be nothing left. "Captain, enemy ships are preparing to fire," the weapons officer called out. "They're targeting the core directly." A cold sweat broke out across Sarah's forehead. The core was the heart of the station, the only thing keeping their remaining systems alive. If it was destroyed, they would be helpless. They had to act fast. She turned to the tactical officer. "Activate the last defense system," she ordered. "All remaining power to the core's shields. We hold them off just long enough to make this count." As the crew followed her orders, the remaining shields flickered weakly to life, just in time to intercept the first volley of enemy fire. The station shuddered violently under the force of the blast, but the shields held, for now. "That won't last long," Harris said, looking at the redouts. "Their ships are too powerful. We need to move quickly." Sarah took a deep breath. Time was running out. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had one last card to play. It was risky, untested, and potentially catastrophic. But if it worked, it could turn the tide. "Prepare the quantum drive," she said, turning to the engineering officer. "We're going to take the fight to them." The room fell silent as the crew processed her words. The quantum drive was a highly experimental weapon, capable of transporting a ship instantly across vast distances. If they could activate it in the right way, they might be able to strike at the heart of the enemy fleet. It was their only hope. "Captain, are you sure about this?" the engineering officer asked, his voice full of hesitation. "We don't have a choice. We're either going to win this war, or we're going to die trying. Now, make it work." The crew worked furiously, their hands flying over controls as they rushed to activate the quantum drive. Sarah stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold on the view screen. The enemy ships were drawing nearer, and the station was on the verge of collapse. She could feel the weight of every life aboard the station pressing on her, but there was no turning back. "Quantum drive is online," the engineer announced, his voice trembling. "But we only have one shot at this. If it doesn't work—" "I know," Sarah cut him off. "Do it." There was a brief moment of silence, a quiet pause before the energy surged through the station. The crew braced themselves, and then, A blinding flash of light erupted from the core, and the entire station seemed to be pulled apart at the seams. The quantum drive roared to life, its raw power displacing the station and sending it hurtling toward the heart of the enemy fleet. For one terrifying instant, it felt as though the very fabric of space itself was tearing. But then, just as quickly as it began, the world snapped back into place. The station, now reeling from the jump, found itself directly in the center of the enemy formation. They had arrived, and they had arrived with a vengeance. "Target the largest ship," Sarah barked. "All remaining power to weapons. We hit them now, with everything we've got." The crew responded in a flash, their movements instinctive, honed by hours of combat. Every available weapon system fired at once, sending a barrage of energy blasts at the lead enemy ship. The screen lit up as the blasts collided with the enemy vessel's shields, causing them to shimmer and crack. "We've got a hit. Direct hit to their main power core," the weapons officer shouted. The enemy flagship staggered, its shields flaring bright before collapsing. But the victory was short-lived. From all sides, enemy ships regrouped, converging on the station, determined to finish the fight. "Captain," Harris shouted urgently, "we can't take much more. They're regrouping for one final strike." Sarah looked out the window, her heart sinking. She knew they were on the brink. The next few moments would decide everything. They either fought their hardest now or faded into history as nothing more than a lost cause. But Sarah's resolve was unbreakable. She would lead her crew to the end, no matter what. "This is our last stand," she said, her voice fierce with defiance. "Let them know humanity will never surrender." The station shook again as the enemy fired, but humanity's fleet held firm. The final battle was upon them, and it was a fight to the death. But in their hearts, they knew they had given everything they could. The last stand had begun. The weapon of hope. The station's systems were hanging on by a thread. Sparks shot from every corner, and the air felt heavy with the scent of burned circuits and overheating machinery. The enemy fleet had regrouped, surrounding humanity's remaining ships from every side, determined to crush them once and for all. But even in the face of certain destruction, Sarah Lane held on to one last hope. An ancient weapon, hidden deep within the bowels of the station, could be their salvation or their final mistake. The engineers had spent hours trying to decipher the strange energy readings they detected earlier. But now, with the fight closing in, Sarah had made the decision. They had to use it. "Captain," Lieutenant Harris said urgently, looking over the final schematics on his console, "the weapon. It's not fully operational. It's a relic from the old war, a prototype from before the Galactic Treaty. It wasn't designed to be used with this kind of force." "I don't care how it was designed," Sarah said, her voice firm. "It's the only chance we've got left. We need to fire it now, before they destroy us." The weapon was called the Solstice Protocol, a doomsday device capable of unleashing a wave of destructive energy strong enough to wipe out entire fleets. Humanity had buried it years ago, afraid of the consequences of such power. But now, with everything hanging in the balance, it was the only hope left. Sarah turned to the chief engineer, who had worked non-stop to prepare the weapon for activation. "How much time?" "Not much," the engineer replied, sweat dripping down his face. "The power transfer is unstable. If we fire it now, we may overload the station's core. The damage could be catastrophic. We won't have time to evacuate." Sarah's gaze hardened. "We'll make the time. Do it." The station trembled as the engineers worked feverishly to reroute all remaining power to the weapon. The Solstice Protocol was not a weapon meant for precision. It was a weapon meant to devastate, to destroy everything in its path. And right now, humanity had no choice but to let it do what it was built for. Outside, the enemy fleet loomed like a nightmare in space. Their dark ships, glimmering with deadly intent, were closing in for the final strike. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest as she watched them approach. The pulse of their weapons charging sent a ripple of anxiety through her body. She knew, deep down, that if they didn't act now, the end would come in a matter of minutes. "Captain, the weapon is online," Harris said, his voice grim. "But we've got one shot at this. We fire now, or we lose everything." Sarah looked around the bridge at the faces of the crew, faces filled with exhaustion, fear, but also unwavering determination. These were the people who had fought for humanity's survival. They had stood their ground when the enemy seemed unstoppable. And now, in the final moments, they had the power to decide their fate. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the chaos around them. "Target the center of the enemy fleet. Fire on my mark." There was no turning back now. The last few minutes of their struggle were about to unfold. The Solstice Protocol was ready, the energy surge building within the station's core, its deadly charge climbing higher and higher with every passing second. Firing in 3, 2, 1. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the station, the weapon discharged. A massive beam of pure, concentrated energy erupted from the heart of the station. It shot through space like a comet, cutting a path through the darkness, as though the stars themselves were being extinguished in its wake. The energy beam collided with the lead ships of the enemy fleet, its impact sending shockwaves through the vacuum of space. The immense power of the blast was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It tore through the dark ships with ease, their shields disintegrating like paper in the wind. The massive vessels were torn apart, their colossal forms disintegrating into fragments of twisted metal. But the Solstice Protocol wasn't done yet. The weapon wasn't just a single shot. It was designed to create a chain reaction, a burst of energy that would continue to ripple outward, consuming everything in its path. The enemy fleet, though vast and powerful, couldn't withstand the force of the weapon. One by one, their ships faltered, their engines failing as the destructive pulse spread through their ranks. Some tried to flee, but it was too late. "Captain, it's working," Harris shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. "The enemy ships are breaking apart. They can't fight this. We've—" But Sarah's words were cut off by a deep, resonating rumble that shook the entire station. The weapon had done its job. It had struck at the heart of the enemy fleet and crippled their forces. But now, the energy backlash was hitting the station itself. The Solstice Protocol had drawn too much power from their already strained systems, and now the core was beginning to overload. "Captain, the core's going critical," the engineer shouted. "We need to evacuate now, or we'll be caught in the blast." Sarah didn't hesitate. All hands to the escape pods. Now, she had bought humanity a victory, but the price was high. The station was already beginning to fall apart, and the crew had no choice but to abandon it. As the escape pods launched into the dark void of space, Sarah took one last look at the station, knowing that it would be their final home. The battle wasn't over yet. Humanity had struck a devastating blow to the enemy, but at what cost? The enemy might retreat for now, but Sarah knew that their victory was only temporary. This war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least for now, humanity had proven that it would never surrender. And that, in itself, was a victory worth fighting for. The final decision. The escape pods sped away from the crumbling station, the distant explosions marking the death throes of humanity's last stronghold. Inside each pod, the crew sat in silence, their faces drawn and weary, the gravity of what had just happened settling in. They had fought with everything they had, against impossible odds, and had dealt a devastating blow to the enemy fleet. But the cost had been high. Too high. Captain Sarah Lane sat in the command pod, her fingers gripping the seat as she stared out the viewport at the wreckage of the station. The flashes of energy from the Solstice Protocol still echoed in the distance, as though space itself was mourning the loss. The station, once a beacon of human ingenuity and progress, was now nothing more than a memory, destroyed but not forgotten. "Captain," Harris's voice crackled over the comms. "We've sustained heavy losses. We lost most of our fleet in the process. But the enemy's retreating. The majority of their forces are either destroyed or scattered." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The enemy had broken, for now. But she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just a temporary victory. Their survival depended on how quickly humanity could regroup and rebuild, and how much time they had before the enemy returned. "Where are we headed?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "We've made contact with the last surviving fleet," Harris responded. "They're in the outer rim, but they're on the move. They're preparing for a retreat, waiting for further orders." Sarah's mind raced. They had no home now. No station, no allies left to support them. Their last remaining ships were scattered, isolated, and exhausted. The enemy had only been slowed, not defeated, and Sarah knew that they would come back, stronger, faster, and with an unrelenting thirst for revenge. "This is not the end," she muttered to herself, more for her own reassurance than anyone else. "We will rebuild. We will fight again." But as she looked out at the vast emptiness of space, the weight of their loss was overwhelming. She had given the order to use the Solstice Protocol, to unleash the power that had saved them. But it had come at a cost, not just to their fleet, but to the very principles humanity had stood for. The weapon was a symbol of desperation, and no matter how many battles they won, she couldn't shake the fear that humanity was teetering on the edge of extinction. "We need to decide what happens next," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "We can't just hide in the outer rim and wait. We need to rebuild our fleet, strengthen our defenses, and take the fight to them before they have time to recover." "But Captain," Harris hesitated, "what if they regroup faster than we anticipate? What if they're already planning their next move?" "I know," Sarah replied, her tone grave. "But we can't live in fear. We've shown them that humanity is not an easy target. We'll rebuild. We'll fight. And when they come for us again, we'll be ready." The rest of the crew was silent, absorbing the weight of her words. There was no certainty in their future, only the bitter reality that humanity's survival now hinged on their resilience and determination. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Sarah knew one thing. They would fight with everything they had. As the escape pods continued to drift into the void, Sarah looked at the distant stars, and for the first time since the attack began, she allowed herself a small, hopeful thought. The Dark Fleet might have devastated their home, but they had not destroyed humanity's spirit. The heart of humanity was still beating, still strong, and still unyielding. It wasn't over. Not yet. But Sarah knew they were far from alone. Humanity had already begun to prove that it could survive anything the universe threw at it, and no matter how dark the sky became, they would never surrender. "Prepare for our next move," she said softly, eyes hardening with resolve. "The fight is just beginning."